What if Alucard landed in Warhammer 40k? The sky above Cadia screamed, not metaphorically, not poetically. It screamed, a sound that shattered eardrums and broke minds before the first drop of blood even fell. Reality tore open like rotten flesh, and through that wound in existence, something ancient fell into a universe that had already forgotten mercy. Guardsmen looked up from their trenches, Luss rifles trembling in mud-caked hands, and saw crimson eyes staring back through the storm. Eyes that had watched empires crumble, eyes that had drunk the blood of gods, eyes that now gazed upon a galaxy where even immortality was just another way to suffer forever. He landed in fire. The impact crater spread outward in perfect silence, that terrible moment before sound catches up to catastrophe. Then the shockwave hit. Tanks flipped like toys, soldiers flew backward, their screams swallowed by the roar of collapsing earth. And in the center of that devastation, wrapped in a crimson coat that seemed to drink the light itself, Alucard stood. Smoke curled from his shoulders, ash fell like snow. He tilted his head, listening to the hymns blaring from voxcasters across the war zone, and smiled. It was not a human smile. It was the grin of something that had stopped pretending centuries ago. The first bolter rounds came within seconds. Astartes, Space Marines of the Black Templars, emerged from the smoke with the mechanical precision of walking cathedrals. Their armor bore the scars of 1,000 battlefields, each dent a prayer, each scratch a hymn written in enemy blood. They opened fire without hesitation, without question, without mercy. Explosive rounds tore through the air, each shell capable of reducing a man to red mist. Alucard stood still. The rounds hit, his body jerked, twisted, exploded, and then, in defiance of every law this universe held sacred, he laughed. The laughter echoed across the battlefield like a funeral bell, his body reformed, flesh knitting from shadow, blood flowing backward through time. Holes closed, limbs regrew, and those crimson eyes never stopped watching. The Space Marines faltered, not from fear, they had been engineered to know no fear, but from confusion, from the terrible recognition that their weapons, blessed by the Emperor himself, had done nothing. One Templar whispered a prayer, another activated his vox, a third simply raised his chainsword and charged, because in the Imperium, faith is measured in how you die, not how you live. Alucard moved, not fast, impossibly fast, faster than thought, faster than the neurons firing in their enhanced brains. He was among them before their battle computers could track his movement. Shadows erupted from his coat like living things, tendrils of darkness that wrapped around ceramite armor and squeezed. Metal groaned, servos snapped, and beneath those shadows, through cracks in their helmets, the Space Marines saw something that even their conditioning couldn't erase. The faces of everyone they had ever killed, staring back from the dark. Alucard whispered something in a language older than the Imperium, older than terror, older than the first human who looked up at the stars and wondered if God was watching. The massacre lasted 7 seconds. When the shadows retreated, 5 Black Templars lay in pieces, their gene seed already dissolving in blood that refused to clot. Alucard stood over them, tilting his head like a curious predator. He reached down, picked up a fallen helmet, and studied the Imperial Aquila engraved on its surface. 2 heads. One looking to the past, one looking to the future, both blind. He dropped it. The helmet clattered against stone, spinning until it came to rest facing the sky, where the warp still bled, where reality still screamed, where something nung vast and terrible had just noticed his arrival. Above the battlefield, in the observation deck of a Lunar-class cruiser, an inquisitor named Vasroth watched through auger arrays, his augmetic eye whirred, focusing on the crimson figure below. Data scrolled across his retinal display. Bioscan, inconclusive. Psycho rating, off-scale. Threat assessment, catastrophic. His human eye, the one still capable of emotion, narrowed. He had hunted demons across 3 sectors. He had purged mutants by the 1,000. He had looked into the eye of terror and lived to remember it. But this was different. This thing wore the shape of a man but moved like blasphemy made flesh. And worst of all, it was smiling. Vasroth turned to his retinue, tech priests, battle sisters, death cult assassins, all of them waiting for orders, all of them ready to die for the Emperor. He spoke 3 words, and they echoed through the ship like a death sentence. Prepare the null field. Because in this galaxy, there are things worse than death. There are things that refuse to die. And when you find something that mocks the Emperor's mercy by refusing oblivion, you don't try to kill it. You try to make it wish it could die. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where even hope has been weaponized into propaganda, immortality is just another curse waiting to break you. If you want to see what happens when an unkillable monster meets a universe that specializes in making death seem merciful, hit that subscribe button. Because this journey into the dark gets so much worse, and you're going to want to witness every horrifying second. To understand what Alucard was, you must first understand what he had been. Centuries ago, in a world that never knew the Emperor's light, he was Vlad Dracula, son of the dragon, prince of a doomed kingdom, warrior who fought against impossible darkness. He lost. Death took him. But death, in its arrogance though, victory was final. It wasn't. He rose again, not as man but as monster, drinking blood and life and souls until he became something beyond mortality, an immortal parasite, a living curse, a being who had consumed so many lives that he contained multitudes, armies of the dead screaming inside his shadow, begging for release that would never come. In his universe, he was apex, unstoppable, the final word in any conflict. Bullets meant nothing. Holy water burned but couldn't kill. Blessed weapons cut deep but never deep enough. He had walked through nuclear fire and laughed. He had been reduced to blood and reformed from memory itself. For centuries, he searched for something, anything, that could give him the peace of true death. A worthy opponent, an equal, someone who could make him feel mortal again, even for a moment. He never found it, until reality broke, until the warp reached across dimensions and pulled him through, dragging him into a universe where gods were real, where faith was ammunition, and where even death had learned to scream. But Warhammer 40,000 does not care about your past. It does not care about your power. It does not care if you drank the blood of armies or lived for 1,000 years. The Imperium of Man operates on a single principle, written in the bones of 1,000,000 dead worlds. If it bleeds, it can die. If it cannot die, it is heresy. And heresy must be purged. Not because the Imperium is cruel, though it is. Not because the Imperium is afraid, though it should be. But because in a galaxy where chaos gods whisper from the space between thoughts, where demons wear human skin like cheap suits, anything that defies natural death is either a weapon of the ruinous powers or something even worse. The Mechanicus detected him first. On Mars, in forges older than most civilizations, tech priests monitored the fabric of reality through instruments that blended prayer with mathematics. When Alucard fell through the warp, their senses screamed. Not figuratively, the machine spirits wailed, cogitators overloaded. One tech priest's augmetic brain suffered a catastrophic logic cascade and melted through his skull, dripping onto holy circuitry. The data was impossible. A warp signature without demonic resonance. A biological entity with non-biological resurrection patterns. A soul that contained thousands of souls. The senior Magos stared at the readings, binary cant scrolling across his vision, and reached one conclusion. This was either a miracle or an abomination. In the Imperium, those two categories often shared the same execution chamber. Word reached the Inquisition within hours. In the fortress monastery of Cardia's southern hemisphere, Inquisitor Vassaroth received the data packet and felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: genuine uncertainty. He had seen things that broke lesser minds. He had interrogated cultists who spoke in tongues that made reality bleed. He had personally executed a planetary governor possessed by 7 demons at once. But this was categorically different. The creature wasn't chaos-touched, wasn't mutated by warp exposure, wasn't anything the Imperium's 10,000 years of xenocide and witch-hunting had prepared them for. It was an outsider, a foreign infection in the body of reality itself. Vassaroth reviewed the battlefield footage again, watched Alucard tear through Black Templars like they were paper, watched shadows move with intelligence, watched a body reform from wounds that should have been fatal 50 times over. He froze the image on Alucard's face, that smile, that terrible recognition that violence was interred. Einement, that death was a joke only he understood. The Inquisitor's fingers traced over a rosarius hanging from his neck, a holy artifact that had saved his life more times than he could count. He whispered a prayer to the Emperor, not for victory, not for strength, but for understanding, because the Imperium could kill anything, given enough firepower. But you couldn't kill what you didn't understand, and understanding was heresy's first whisper. The orders went out across encrypted Vox channels. Mobilize the Ordo Hereticus, prepare containment protocols, activate null field generators, dispatch battle sisters from the Order of Our Martyred Lady, request Adeptus Arbites support, lock down all civilian sectors within 100 kilometers. Standard procedure for Class Omega threats, entities that threatened not just lives, but the metaphysical foundations of Imperial faith. Vasroth knew the protocol by heart. Contain, interrogate, classify, execute, clean, pray, repeat. 10,000 years of the same cycle, cleansing the same sins from new flesh. But something in his augmetic heart, the mechanical thing that beat in place of humanity, stuttered. Because protocols assumed you were dealing with something from this universe, something that followed this reality's rules. Alucard did not follow rules. He was the exception that proved every law wrong. And as Imperial forces converged on his position, tanks grinding across ash fields, aircraft screaming through polluted skies, priests chanting hymns from armored vehicles, he stood alone on that battlefield and waited. Not because he was afraid, not because he was strategic, but because for the first time in centuries, something had finally surprised him. This universe smelled wrong, tasted wrong. The air itself carried the weight of despair so thick it was almost liquid. The sky wasn't just dark, it was wounded, bleeding colors that hurt to perceive, and somewhere, far away, yet impossibly close, something vast was watching him, something that made even his ancient soul feel small. He looked up at the stars, at the eye of terror bleeding across the void, and whispered 4 words that would seal his fate. Finally, something interesting. They took him without a fight. That was the first mistake. When the containment force arrived, 50 battle sisters, 2 companies of Arbites, and 3 null field generators mounted on Chimera chassis, Alucard simply raised his hands in mock surrender. The sisters hesitated, bolters trained on his chest, fingers hovering over triggers that had ended 1,000 heretical lives. Their leader, Canoness Imelda, spoke through her helmet's Vox grill, her voice distorted into something between prayer and threat. She demanded his name, his origin, his allegiance. He answered with a smile and 3 words that made her blood freeze. I am inevitable. Then he walked toward the transport ship, shadows trailing behind him like a funeral procession, and let them bind him in chains blessed by the ecclesiarchy itself. The interrogation chamber existed 3 kilometers beneath Cadia's surface, carved from bedrock and lined with black stone, that rare mineral that dulled psyche. Icy power and made demons scream just by proximity. The walls were covered in scripture, thousands of verses written in blood and gold, prayers that had taken servitors decades to complete. Candles burned in iron sconces, their flames never flickering despite the recycled air. In the center of the room sat a chair, more throne than furniture, built from the same black stone as the walls, covered in purity seals and wired with neural probes designed to read thoughts and punish lies with electric agony. Alucard sat in that chair, chains wrapped around his arms and legs, and looked utterly comfortable, like a king waiting for subjects to stop wasting his time. Inquisitor Vasroth entered flanked by 2 servo skulls and a tech priest whose face had been replaced entirely by a bronze mask of the machine god. The Inquisitor was a tall man, thin in the way that soldiers become after decades of war, muscles stretched over bone, nothing wasted, everything weaponized. His face was scarred from a demon's claws, 3 parallel lines that ran from forehead to jaw. One eye was augmetic, glowing red in the chamber's dim light. He wore black carapace armor under a crimson coat marked with the inquisitorial seal. At his hip hung a bolt pistol, a power sword, and a rosarius that pulsed with faint holy light. He looked at Alucard for a full minute before speaking, studying him the way a surgeon studies a tumor. "You are an abomination," Vasroth said finally. His voice was cold, clinical, the voice of someone who had said those words 1,000 times to 1,000 different monsters. "You exist outside the Emperor's natural order. You mock death, which is the Emperor's final mercy. You wear human skin but are not human. You are warp-touched but not demonic. You are psycho-adjacent but register no psychic signature. You are, by every metric we possess, impossible." He stepped closer, his augmetic eye whirring as it scanned Alucard's face. "So I will ask you once, and only once. What are you, and which of the ruinous powers do you serve?" Alucard tilted his head, and for the first time since arriving in this universe, his smile faltered. Not from fear, from fascination. "Ruinous powers," he repeated, tasting the words like wine. "You have gods here, real ones, not the metaphors and myths I knew, but actual entities that feed on worship and suffering." He laughed, a sound that made the candle flames shudder. "How delightfully honest. In my world, gods hid behind symbolism. Here, they're just another predator in the food chain." His crimson eyes locked onto Vasroth's human one. "I serve no one, Inquisitor. I never have. I consume, I endure, and I am very, very curious about what happens when something that cannot die meets a universe that has weaponized death itself." The null field activated. 3 generators powered up simultaneously, their hum rising to a painful frequency that made the air vibrate. Invisible waves of anti-psychic energy flooded the chamber, crushing down on reality itself, forcing the warp away like oil repelled by water. The effect was immediate. Alucard's shadows recoiled, pulling back into his coat like burned fingers. His smile vanished, his body tensed, the first genuine physical reaction he'd shown since his arrival. The tech priest monitored readings. Inner cant streaming from his vocabulator in rapid bursts. Vasroth watched carefully, noting every micro-expression, every muscle twitch. The null field was not the absence of power. It was the silence of God. A space where miracles could not happen, where faith had no purchase, where even the warp itself turned away in horror. "Interesting," Alucard whispered, though his voice sounded strained for the first time. "You've built a cage out of nothing, a prison made from the concept of emptiness." He tried to move his shadows again, those tendrils of darkness that had torn through Space Marines like paper, but they barely flickered. His regeneration slowed. The bullet wounds from earlier, which had closed in seconds, now remained as shallow indents in his flesh. He was still immortal, still unkillable by conventional means, but diminished, muted, like a voice screaming underwater. He looked up at Vasroth and grinned again, but this time there was something desperate in it, something almost human. "So this is what it feels like, to be ordinary, to be limited, to be..." He paused, searching for the right word. "Mortal." Vasroth nodded slowly. "You feel it, don't you? The silence, the absence. This field doesn't just suppress psychic power. It suppresses the fundamental connection between soul and warp. You are not connected to our warp creature, but you are still a soul, still anchored to something beyond flesh, and in this room, that anchor is cut." He drew his bolt pistol, the weapon hissing as its machine spirit awakened. "I will give you one more chance. Speak truthfully, and your death will be quick. Lie, and I will keep you in this field until you beg for the Emperor's mercy, which I assure you will not come." The servo skulls floated closer, their optical sensors recording every moment, preserving this interrogation for the Ordo Hereticus archives. History in the making, another monster about to be catalogued and erased. Alucard looked at the gun, at the Inquisitor, at the walls covered in prayers, and then he did something that Vasroth, in 30 years of hunting heretics, had never seen before. Alucard closed his eyes, leaned back in the blackstone chair, and sighed, a sound of pure, genuine relief. "Finally," he whispered, "something that actually hurts." Then he opened his eyes, and the shadows exploded outward, despite the null field, despite the chains, despite every holy safeguard the Imperium had placed around him. Because the field could suppress the warp, it could smother psychic power, it could silence the gods. But Alucard was not of the warp. He was something older, something that existed before the concept of chaos. And in his desperation to feel mortal again, he had just discovered a terrible truth. Pain, real pain, made him stronger. The chains shattered, the Inquisitor fired, and the chamber filled with screams. Vasroth died first. Not immediately, that would have been mercy. The bolt round hit Alucard's center mass, detonating inside his chest cavity with enough force to vaporize a normal man's torso. For one heartbeat, the Inquisitor thought he had succeeded. Then the smoke cleared. Alucard stood with a hole through his sternum large enough to see through, organs hanging like wet decorations, and he was laughing. His hand shot forward faster than augmetic reflexes could track. Fingers closed around Vasroth's throat, not crushing, just holding. The Inquisitor fired again. 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 Each shot tearing through undead flesh, each wound closing slower than before, but still closing. And Alucard leaned close, his breath cold against Vasroth's face, and whispered, "Your Emperor cannot save you from what I am, because I am not his sin, I am someone else's." The tech priest lasted 3 seconds longer. His mechanical body moved with hydraulic efficiency. Combat protocols activate. Eyeing as weapons sprouted from his robes, lascuters, plasma torches, blessed incense burners modified to spray promethium. He calculated trajectories, threat assessments, optimal firing solutions. His cogitators ran through 70,000 combat scenarios in the time it took a human to blink. None of them mattered. Alucard's shadows wrapped around him like a shroud, and the tech priest learned a terrible lesson that the Mechanicus had never coded into their databases. Machine spirits can scream. The servo skulls fell from the air, their optical sensors cracked and weeping oil. The null field generators overloaded simultaneously, their machine spirits dying in a cascade of sparks and binary wails. And in the sudden psychic vacuum left behind, something far away noticed. In the warp, that dimension of madness that pressed against reality like infection against skin, the 4 ruinous powers stirred. Khorne, the blood god, whose throne was built from the skulls of the slain, felt a new flavor of violence bleed into his domain. Not the hot rage of warriors, not the cold efficiency of soldiers, something older, hunger disguised as war, slaughter as sacrament. He leaned forward on his brass throne, and across 1 billion battlefields, warriors suddenly felt the urge to stop killing and start feeding. Slaanesh, the Prince of Pleasure, who lived in the space between sensation and addiction, felt a soul that had tasted every excess and found them all wanting. A being that pursued perfection through consumption, beauty through horror, temptation incarnate. The Dark Prince whispered into the ears of cultists across 1,000 worlds, and they all said the same thing. He tastes like despair wrapped in desire. Nurgle, the Plague Father, whose garden grew every disease that ever existed and many that hadn't been invented yet, felt something wrong. Not wrong like disease. Disease was natural, inevitable, a gift. This was wrong like a wound that refused to rot, like immortality without decay, like something that should have died centuries ago but kept walking out of spite. His laughter, wet, phlegmy, joyful, echoed through putrid halls. He loved all his children, even the ones who denied him, especially those, because everything rots eventually, even refusal, even defiance, even immortal things learn to embrace entropy given enough time. And Tzeentch, the architect of fate, who saw every possible future branching like a crystal maze, saw something he had not predicted. An outsider variable, a piece from a different game dropped onto his board. He studied this anomaly with all 999 eyes and reached a conclusion that made even him uneasy. Alucard's fate was not written in the warp, because he came from a place where fate was authored differently. The moment the null field died, psychic energy flooded back into the chamber like water through a broken dam. But it wasn't just energy, it was attention, the gaze of entities so vast that their perception alone could shatter minds. Alucard felt it immediately, a pressure inside his skull, behind his eyes, underneath his thoughts. Something was looking at him, multiple somethings, vast intelligences circling like sharks around wounded prey. He dropped Vasroth's corpse and stumbled backward, shadows flickering erratically around him. For the first time since falling into this universe, he felt something he hadn't experienced in centuries, genuine fear. Not fear of death, he had welcomed that for so long it felt like an old friend. Fear of something worse, fear of being noticed by things that existed in dimensions his mind couldn't properly comprehend. The walls began to bleed, not metaphorically. The scripture carved into blackstone started weeping blood that ran upward, defying gravity, forming patterns that hurt to perceive. The air thickened into something between liquid and concept. Temperature became meaningless. It was simultaneously freezing and burning, the cold of the void mixed with the heat of a star going nova. Alucard tried to move toward the exit, but space itself had become unreliable. 3 steps forward took him 2 steps back. The doorway stretched into infinity, then compressed to the size of a pinhole, and through that pinhole he saw them, the faces of everyone he had ever killed. Thousands, tens of thousands, armies of the dead pressing against the membrane of reality, trying to claw their way back into existence through the wound his presence had created. He had consumed souls before. That was his nature. Every person he killed, every drop of blood he drank, added to the multitude screaming inside his shadow. In his universe, they had no power. They were just fuel, memories, data stored in the architecture of his immortality. But here, in a universe where belief had weight, where faith could shape reality, where souls were actual tangible currency traded between gods. Here, those consumed souls were anchors, chains, debts written in a language the warp could read. The Chaos Gods looked at Alucard and saw not a predator, but a feast, a single entity containing multitudes, a buffet wrapped in arrogance. Khorne wanted his violence, Slaanesh wanted his excess, Nurgle wanted his refusal to decay, Tzeentch wanted to study how something from outside could exist inside. They all reached for him at once. The chamber exploded, not with fire or force, but with presence. Reality cracked like glass under pressure. Through those cracks the warp bled in, colors that didn't exist, sounds that predated language, sensations that violated the basic contract between flesh and consciousness. Alucard screamed, not from pain he could handle, from recognition. He had spent centuries as the apex predator, the final boss, the monster that monsters feared. And in one terrible moment of clarity, as 4 god hands reached through dimensions to claim him, he understood what every other creature in Warhammer 40,000 had always known. In this universe, you are never the biggest monster. You are just the next meal. And immortality doesn't mean you live forever. It means you suffer forever. The shadows around him writhed, the souls inside him wailed, and somewhere in the distance, growing closer with every heartbeat, he heard laughter that wasn't his own. The first demon came through the ceiling, or what used to be the ceiling. Space had stopped making sense. Up was sideways, forward was yesterday, and the walls breathed with lungs they shouldn't have. It was a bloodletter of Khorne, 7 feet of crimson muscle and rage, holding a blade forged from a concept that meant ending. Its face was all teeth and fury, and it spoke in a language that translated directly into violence. No words, just the promise of blood. It swung its hellblade down toward Alucard's neck, and for one perfect moment, the vampire felt something he hadn't experienced in so long. He'd forgotten what to call it. Excitement. The blade came down. Alucard caught it with his bare hand. The demon's eyes widened. If things born from rage could even experience surprise. Alucard smiled. Not the amused smile of someone playing with food, not the cruel smile of a torturer. This was the smile of a starving man invited to a feast. "You," he whispered, his voice thick with hunger, "are made of soul stuff, raw, unfiltered, pure." His grip tightened on the blade. His palm split open, blood running down the demon's weapon, but the blood didn't fall. It climbed, crawling up the blade like living vines, wrapping around the demon's arm, pulling it closer. The bloodletter tried to pull away, tried to disperse back into the warp. Couldn't, because Alucard's shadow had already wrapped around it, and shadows in his world were not absence of light. They were prisons for the dead. The demon screamed, a sound of pure rage turning to pure fear as Alucard pulled it forward and bit. Consuming a demon is not like consuming mortal flesh. Mortals are simple: blood, memory, maybe a flicker of soul if they're lucky. Demons are concepts given form. They are emotions crystallized into matter. They are pieces of gods walking around wearing the skin of nightmares. When Alucard's teeth sank into the bloodletter's throat, he tasted rage, not anger, not fury, pure, undiluted, infinite rage that had existed since the first murder, the first war, the first time a thinking being looked at another and chose violence. It burned going down, like drinking molten brass, like swallowing the heat of every battlefield that ever existed. His body convulsed, his shadow shuddered, and somewhere deep inside, in the prison where he kept all his consumed souls, something new screamed as it joined the multitude. More came. They poured through the cracks in reality like water through a sieve, pink horrors that giggled as they cast spells that turned air into knives, plague-bearers that spread disease with every step, demonettes that moved with hypnotic grace and offered pleasure that would shatter minds. They came because they sensed weakness, because he had screamed, because the four gods wanted him, and what the gods wanted, their servants delivered. 20 demons, 30, 50. The chamber became a war zone between dimensions, and in the center of it all stood Alucard, coat billowing with shadow and stolen soul stuff, fighting not for victory, but for survival. Every daemon he killed, he consumed. Every essence he devoured, he added to his collection. And with each addition, he felt himself changing, expanding, becoming something even he didn't recognize. The souls inside him were screaming louder now. The multitude, all those humans he'd consumed over centuries, were no longer just memories. They were becoming aware. Because in this universe, in this galaxy where thought and reality were lovers locked in violent embrace, belief had power. And thousands of consumed souls believing they were trapped, believing they were suffering, believing they were in hell, made it true. Alucard could feel them clawing at the inside of his essence, trying to escape, trying to break free. Each demon he consumed made it worse, because demons weren't meant to be eaten by mortals. They were made of warp stuff. They were sustained by the immaterium, and by bringing them inside himself, Alucard was essentially swallowing pieces of the dimension itself. He was becoming a door, a gateway, a wound through which the warp could bleed into reality. A keeper of secrets appeared, greater demon of Slaanesh, 12 feet of androgynous perfection and surgical claws. It moved like music made flesh, every sea, tepa dance, every gesture an invitation to damnation. It spoke with 6 mouths, and each mouth said something different, but all the words meant the same thing. Join us, embrace excess, become perfect through sensation. It offered him everything he'd ever wanted, an end to boredom, an end to the search for meaning, an end to the hollow feeling of immortality. It offered him sensation beyond imagination, pain and pleasure mixed until they were indistinguishable, the chance to feel everything. And for just a moment, Alucard hesitated, because wasn't that what he'd wanted? Wasn't that why he'd spent centuries searching for a worthy opponent, to feel alive again? Then he remembered something, a conversation from long ago in a universe that no longer existed for him. His master, a woman who had enslaved him, controlled him, made him a weapon, had once asked, "What do you want, Alucard?" And he had answered without hesitation, "To be human, not powerful, not immortal, not feared or worshipped or perfect, just human, with human limitations, human mortality, human meaning." The Keeper of Secrets was offering the exact opposite: transcendence through excess, immortality through sensation, meaning through endless experience. It was everything he had run from, everything he had rejected, everything he had killed to escape. His answer came not in words, but in violence. He lunged forward, shadows exploding outward, and met the greater demon in combat that no mortal eye should witness. The battle lasted 3 seconds and 3 eternities simultaneously. Time had given up trying to make sense. Alucard and the Keeper of Secrets collided in a space between heartbeats, trading blows that rewrote local physics, each strike carving wounds into dimensions. The demon was faster, more experienced, better designed for this kind of combat. But Alucard had one advantage it didn't. He was not of this universe. His shadows operated on rules the warp didn't recognize. His regeneration pulled from something outside Chaos's dominion. And when he finally tore the demon's essence apart and consumed it, drank deep of pleasure, pain perfection crystallized into liquid madness, he felt something inside him break. Not his body, not his power, but his self. The thing that made him Alucard. The identity he'd clung to through centuries. It cracked. And through that crack, the warp rushed in like a flood, and he realized with cold horror that he was no longer consuming the demons. They were consuming him from the inside out. Reality gave up pretending. The chamber dissolved like sugar in acid, walls melting into abstract concepts, floor becoming a membrane between what is and what could be. Alucard fell, not down, there was no down anymore, but inward, through layers of existence that weren't meant to be traversed by things with names and memories. He fell through his own shadow, through the prison where he kept his consumed souls, and for the first time in centuries, he heard them clearly, not screaming, worse, talking, thousands of voices speaking in perfect unison, asking the same question over and over. Where are we? Where are we? Where are we? And he had no answer, because he didn't know anymore. Was he in the warp? Was he in his own mind? Was there even a difference in a universe where thought and space were the same thing? The immaterium opened beneath him like a mouth. No, not beneath, around, inside. The warp wasn't a place you entered, it was a state of being you became, and Alucard, who had spent centuries existing as a paradox, as something that should be dead but wasn't, found himself finally in a dimension that appreciated contradictions. Here, he could be alive and dead simultaneously, could be one person and 1,000 people, could be matter and concept, could be predator and prey. The warp didn't judge, didn't care, it simply was, an infinite ocean of emotion and madness where the only rule was that belief shaped reality, and Alucard believed in too many things at once. He believed he was immortal, he believed he deserved death, he believed he was a monster, he believed he wanted to be human. Every contradictory thought became real here, pulling him in different directions, tearing him apart not physically but existentially. Colors that had no names swirled around him. He saw memories that weren't his. Someone's childhood on a world with 3 suns, a soldier's last moment before a bullet found his brain, a mother watching her child burn in a viral bombing. No, wait, these were his memories, souls he'd consumed, people he'd killed. In his universe, they had been data, storage. But here, where souls were currency and memory had weight, they were real. They existed inside him as fully conscious entities, trapped in a hell of his making. And their suffering was his suffering because the warp recognized no boundary between self and other. He tried to scream, tried to assert his dominance over the multitude, but his voice came out in 1,000 different tones. Men, women, children, soldiers, civilians, everyone he'd ever consumed speaking through his mouth at once. A face materialized in the swirling madness. Not human, not demon, something in between. It wore his face, his crimson eyes, his cruel smile, but distorted, elongated, multiplied across itself like a fractal. "Hello," it said, and its voice was his voice echoed through infinite layers. "I am what you're becoming, the sum of all parts, the prison that walks, the graveyard that hungers." It reached out with hands that were simultaneously flesh and shadow and concept. "You spent centuries collecting souls like a child collects coins, but you never asked what they thought about being collected, never wondered if they wanted to be your ammunition, your fuel, your reason for existing." The face leaned closer, and Alucard could see himself reflected in its eyes. 1,000 versions of himself, all slightly different, all equally lost. "I wanted to die," Alucard whispered, and the words felt like confession, like prayer, like the first honest thing he'd said in centuries. "I searched for someone strong enough to kill me, someone worthy. I wanted an end." The face smiled, and it was not kind, not cruel, just honest. "You're in the wrong universe for that wish, vampire. Death here is not an ending, it's a transaction, a change of ownership. You die, your soul enters the warp, and you become food for something else. Everyone is eaten eventually, everyone becomes part of the cycle. There is no mercy, no peace, no final rest, just different flavors of suffering. It gestured around them, at the swirling chaos, at the screaming colors, at the weight of infinite possibility crushing down like water pressure at the bottom of an ocean trench. Welcome to forever. Something enormous moved in the distance. No, not distance. There was no distance in the warp. Something enormous moved in the adjacent, in the conceptual space right next to where Alucard floated. He felt it before he saw Atui. A pressure that made stars feel like dust. A presence so vast that comprehending even a fraction of it would shatter his mind like glass under a hammer. It was multiple things at once. Rage and excess and decay and change. The four gods moving together but separately, circling him like predators deciding which part to bite first. They had noticed him before. Now they were studying him, and in their attention, he felt his identity dissolving further. His name became less certain, his memories less solid. Was he Vlad? Was he Dracula? Was he Alucard? Was he all the souls he'd consumed screaming in unison? The warp didn't care about his origin story, it only cared about what he was now. A vessel, a container, a door that something could walk through. Khorne spoke first, and his voice was every battlefield that ever existed speaking at once. You consume to feel strong, I appreciate that. Honest violence, direct hunger, but you lack purpose. Let me give you purpose. Be my champion, kill in my name, spill blood for the blood god, and I will make your eternity meaningful. The offer hung in the psychic air like smoke. Alucard felt the temptation, not because he wanted to serve, but because purpose, any purpose, was better than this aimless drifting through madness. Then Nurgle's voice followed, wet, cheerful, loving in the way that rot loves wood. Or embrace decay, little vampire. You've been fighting entropy for centuries. Stop fighting. Let go. Accept that all things end, even you, especially you. I'll take away the burden of trying. No more searching, no more struggling. Just rest. Slaanesh whispered next, a voice like silk dragged across raw nerves. They offer you servitude. I offer you everything, every sensation, every experience, every possible permutation of pleasure and pain. You wanted to feel alive? I'll make you feel more alive than existence itself. You'll never be bored again, never be empty, never be hollow. And finally, Tzinch, his voice not a voice but an equation, a plan, a possibility, space collapsing into probability. Or choose change, become something new, shed this outdated concept of self, evolve beyond the limitations of what you were. I can show you futures where you're a god, timelines where you've always been part of my design. All I ask is that you trust the process. 4 offers, 4 eternities, 4 different flavors of damnation. And Alucard, suspended in the space between all possible decisions, realized the terrible truth. He was going to choose, because not choosing was still a choice, and in the warp, every choice was final. Alucard laughed. It started as a single voice, his voice, the one he remembered from before the warp tried to digest him, and built into a chorus, all the souls inside him laughing together, not from joy, from the absurdity of it all, from the cosmic joke that he'd spent centuries hunting for death, only to land in a universe where death was just another form of slavery. The 4 gods recoiled slightly, not from fear but from confusion. Mortal souls didn't laugh when offered ascension. They begged, they accepted, they broke. They never found the situation funny. But Alucard had stopped being normal centuries ago, and if there was one thing he'd learned in his immortal existence, it was this. When monsters offer you a deal, you spit in their faces and see what happens next. No, he said, and the word echoed through the immaterium like a bell made of denial. I've been a slave before, contro, held by orders, bound by seals, commanded by humans who thought they could leash what I am. I broke every chain, killed every master, burned every contract. I did not survive centuries of servitude just to kneel before gods who are, quite frankly, less creative than my previous owners. The psychic pressure around him intensified. The 4 gods were not accustomed to rejection, especially not from something as insignificant as a single soul. Khorne's rage pressed down like a mountain. Slaanesh's disappointment felt like knives under skin. Nurgle's sadness wept diseases into the space around him. Tzeentch's curiosity became surgical, dissecting, invasive, and through it all, Alucard kept laughing. "You want to know what's funny?" His voice stabilized, pulling together from the 1,000 fragments, forcing unity through sheer spite. "You're gods, actual gods, but you're also parasites. You need us. You feed on emotion, on worship, on the psychic energy of mortal suffering. Without us, you're nothing, just concepts floating in a void, and that makes you weak." The warp shuddered. Around him, colors inverted, space folded in on itself like paper crumpling. He'd insulted them, not just refused, insulted, and in a dimension where words had weight, where belief shaped reality, where thought was as dangerous as weapons, insults from a soul that contained multitudes carried more force than he'd intended. Cracks appeared in the psychic pressure surrounding him, small gaps, moments of uncertainty, and Alucard, who had built a career out of exploiting weakness, saw his chance. He reached inward, into the prison of souls he'd carried for centuries, into the multitude screaming inside his shadow, and instead of suppressing them, controlling them, using them as fuel, he released them, not back into reality. There was no reality here, but into the warp itself. Thousands of souls burst outward like an explosion of broken glass, each one carrying memories of a different world, a different universe, a different set of physical laws. Souls that had never been touched by the four gods. Souls that didn't fit into Khorne's violence, or Slaanesh's excess, or Nurgle's decay, or Tzeentch's schemes. Foreign data injected into a system that had no framework for processing it. The warp convulsed. For just a moment, the four gods' attention fragmented, pulled in different directions by this sudden flood of incompatible information. That moment was all he needed. Alucard pulled his essence together, what remained of Vlad, of Dracula, of the vampire who'd drunk the blood of armies, and moved, not away. There was no away in the warp, but through, slipping between the cracks in divine attention like a knife between ribs. He dove deeper into the immaterium, away from the four gods' immediate grasp, into regions where their power thinned and stranger things dwelt. Places where the warp remembered what it was before chaos defined it. Ancient spaces filled with emotions so old they'd been forgotten. Joy without cruelty, sorrow without despair, fear that was just caution instead of terror. He swam through psychic currents like a drowning man clawing toward air, knowing that air might not exist but clawing anyway because the alternative was giving up. And then he felt it, a presence. Not like the four gods, not vast or overwhelming or crushing. This was focused, singular, sharp like a blade cutting through fog. It came from a specific direction, though direction barely means anything here. A golden light that didn't belong in the warp's madness, a psychic beacon so powerful it burned away the surrounding chaos just by existing. For a moment, Alucard thought he'd found sanctuary. Then he got closer, close enough to feel the sheer fury radiating from that light, the contempt, the absolute certainty that anything touched by the warp deserved only annihilation. And he understood with sudden, terrible clarity. He had swum directly toward the psychic echo of the God Emperor of mankind, the one being in this entire galaxy whose hatred for chaos matched his own hatred for eternity. The Emperor's attention turned toward him, not physically. The Emperor was a corpse on a throne 10,000 light-years away, sustained by psychic power and the daily sacrifice of 1,000 souls. But in the warp, consciousness and presence were the same thing. The Emperor was everywhere his will reached, and his will had just noticed an anomaly, a foreign soul contaminated with demonic essence, wrapped in shadows that operated on non-warp rules, screaming with 1,000 voices that didn't belong to this reality. From the Emperor's perspective, Alucard looked exactly like what he'd spent 10,000 years fighting, a chaos corruption wearing human skin. The psychic light intensified. Golden fire that had burned demons from existence turned its focus on him, and Alucard realized his mistake too late. He'd escaped the four gods' temptation only to stumble into their greatest enemy's crosshairs, and in the cosmic war between order and chaos, there was no room for things that belonged to neither. The Emperor's psychic strike came like a sword made of judgment itself, absolute, merciless, designed to unmake anything touched by the warp. Alucard tried to dodge, tried to slip away, but he was exhausted, his identity fractured, his power depleted from releasing the multitude. The golden blade struck him center mass, and he felt something he'd never felt before. Not pain, not fear, but erasure, the sensation of being unmade at a fundamental level, of his existence being deleted from the cosmic record. He tried to regenerate, couldn't, tried to reform, couldn't. The shadows that had always protected him evaporated under holy fire. And as his consciousness began to dissolve, Alucard had one final thought. In trying to escape becoming a slave to gods, he'd simply found a different god who didn't bother with offers, who just destroyed anything that didn't fit his vision of what humanity should be. The Emperor's judgment burned, not like fire burns flesh, but like truth burns lies, like certainty erases doubt, like order imposes itself on chaos through sheer, uncompromising will. Alucard felt pieces of himself disappearing, not dying but simply ceasing to have ever existed. Memories evaporated, centuries of experience deleted like files from a corrupted drive. He tried to hold on to his name, tried to remember who he'd been. Was he Vlad? The name felt wrong, foreign, like a word from a language he'd never spoken. Was he Dracula? That felt like someone else's story, a myth he'd heard once but couldn't quite recall. Was he Alucard? Even that seemed distant now, just letters arranged in an order that used to mean something. The golden light pressed deeper, and he felt his identity, crumbling like sand through fingers that no longer existed. But something resisted. Deep inside what remained of his essence, in the spaces where he'd stored consumed souls, something pushed back against the Emperor's judgment. Not the souls themselves, they were long gone, released into the warp, but the shape they'd left behind, the grooves worn into his existence by centuries of consumption, the psychological architecture of being a predator, the fundamental pattern of what he was beneath the names and memories and personality. You could erase the vampire, you could delete the count, you could unmake the legend, but the hunger itself, pure, primal, older than civilization, that couldn't be burned away, because it wasn't corruption, it was nature, the same force that made stars consume hydrogen, that made black holes devour light, that made life feed on life in an endless amoral cycle. The Emperor could purge chaos, but he couldn't purge the basic mathematics of existence. The golden blade hesitated. For just a fraction of a moment, the Emperor's psychic strike paused, as if considering, and in that pause, Alucard understood something that maybe even the Emperor himself had forgotten after 10,000 years on the Golden Throne. You cannot destroy hunger by hating it. You can only redirect it, starve it, give it new prey. But the fundamental principle of consumption remains, and Alucard, stripped of identity, personality, everything that made him an individual, was now just pure hunger wrapped in whatever scraps of memory hadn't been burned away. He was no longer a person. He was a function, a process, an algorithm that ran on soul stuff instead of electricity. And processes don't die, they just change what they process. The warp noticed, of course it did. The warp noticed everything eventually, when the Emperor's strike failed to fully unmake him, when that core of hunger proved indestructible. The four gods leaned closer again, not to tempt this time, to claim, because something that survived the Emperor's judgment was valuable, was worth fighting over. Horn saw a weapon that could never be destroyed, only aimed. Slaanesh saw hunger perfected, desire without the burden of identity. Nurgle saw inevitable entropy, even immortality reduced to base function. Tzeentch saw a variable that changed the equation, a piece that could evolve into anything depending on which god fed it first. They reached for him simultaneously, four cosmic hands trying to grab the same prize, and where their powers intersected, reality broke in new and interesting ways. Alucard, or what had been Alucard, felt himself being pulled in four directions at once. His essence, already fragmented by the Emperor's strike, shattered further. A piece went toward Horn, carrying all his memories of violence, all his centuries of killing. A piece went toward Slaanesh, carrying his fascination with sensation, his desperate need to feel something. A piece went toward Nurgle, carrying his exhaustion, his desire for rest, his acceptance that maybe decay was better than eternal struggle. And a piece went toward Tzeentch, carrying his curiosity, his love of change, his fundamental rejection of staying the same. 4 pieces, 4 gods, 4 different eternities, and between them, in the space where nothing should exist, a 5th piece remained. The smallest piece, the core that even the gods couldn't quite grasp, the part that still remembered, faintly, like an echo of an echo, what it meant to be human. That fragment tried to scream, tried to protest, tried to assert that this wasn't what he wanted, wasn't what he'd searched Sentu. Rhys 4 wasn't the worthy death he'd craved, but it had no voice anymore, no body, no power, just awareness without form, watching as the 4 gods divided his power between them like wolves tearing apart a carcass. He watched his capacity for violence become Khorne's weapon, watched his hunger for sensation become Slaanesh's toy, watched his yearning for peace become Nurgle's joke, watched his adaptability become Tzeentch's experiment. And the worst part, the part that broke whatever remained of his sanity, was that each piece thought it was still him. Each fragment believed it was Alucard, continuing his story, just in a different direction. 4 versions of himself, serving 4 different gods, each convinced they were the real one, each absolutely certain they'd made the right choice. The small fragment drifted, not toward any god, not toward the Emperor's light, just away, into the deepest parts of the warp where even demons rarely ventured, where the Immaterium remembered older things, where emotions existed that predated sapient thought, simple feelings from before life learned to complicate itself with philosophy, basic sensations, heat, cold, pressure, release, the fundamental experiences of existing before existence meant anything. He drifted through psychic spaces that were neither order nor chaos, just raw, unfiltered. And slowly, so slowly he barely noticed it happening, he began to forget even that tiny core identity, forgot what names were, forgot what meaning felt like, forgot that he'd ever been anything except this, a spark of awareness floating through infinity, unable to die, unable to live, unable to do anything except exist and remember that once, a very long time ago, in a place that might have been real, something called Alucard had wanted to be human. And somewhere far above, or below, or beside, or inside, the galaxy continued turning. The Imperium fought its wars. The Chaos Gods played their games. The Emperor sat on his throne and burned and burned and burned. On 100 worlds, Inquisitors filed reports about a red-coated figure seen in the heat of battle, laughing as he killed. On another 100 worlds, priests reported visions of a crimson shadow whispering temptations. On dead worlds circling dying stars, plague victims claimed they saw a vampire offering peace through surrender. On Forge worlds, tech priests discovered corrupted data about a being that changed with every telling. 4 legends, 4 different creatures, 4 pieces of the same broken whole. And in the official records of the Inquisition, in sealed vaults beneath the most holy temples, a single notation appeared in a file marked Unsolved Anomalies. The red shade of the warp. Classification: uncertain. Threat level: variable. Status: dispersed but not destroyed. Recommendation: continued observation. Final note, written in Vasroth's handwriting before he died. Some things cannot be killed, only scattered. Pray we scattered him far enough. 3 centuries passed. In the Imperium, that's barely a footnote. Worlds rose and fell. Crusades launched and failed. Entire sectors burned and were rebuilt. The bureaucracy of humanity's corpse empire ground forward with the inevitability of entropy itself. And through it all, the legends grew. Not the truth. Nobody remembered the truth anymore. Just stories. Whispers passed between soldiers in trenches. Myths traded by void sailors during long journeys through the warp. Urban legends among hive gangers who'd never seen sky. The red shade, the crimson phantom, the laughing death, the vampire of Cadia. Each name slightly different, each story contradicting the last. Some said he served the blood god. Theirs claimed he tempted the faithful towards Slaanesh. Nurgle's followers spoke of him as a herald of acceptance. Tzeentch's cultists saw him as proof of transformation. Nobody agreed. Everyone had seen something different, and that was precisely the problem. On a forge world called Metallica Secundus, a senior Magos named Arcturus Prime reviewed data streams that made no sense. Sightings of the red shade appeared across multiple sectors simultaneously, physically impossible unless he could be in dozens of places at once. Witness descriptions varied wildly. Some reported a tall figure in crimson, others a shadow with eyes. Some claimed he was beautiful, others said he was monstrous beyond description. The only constant was the laughter. Every report, regardless of sector or time frame, mentioned laughter. Not the laughter of madness, not the laughter of cruelty, just amusement, as if reality itself was a joke only he understood. Arcturus ran the data through pattern recognition algorithms blessed by the Omnissiah. The results came back corrupted, every time, as if the mere act of trying to understand him introduced errors into the system. On a cardinal world named Ophelia VII, Sister Superior Magdalena of the Order of Our Martyred Lady knelt in prayer before a shrine of Saint Celestine. She had seen him 14 years ago during the purge of Hive Mortis. Her squad had been surrounded by cultists, 30 battle sisters against 500 heretics high on stims and chaos promises. They fought well, died well, but they would have lost. Then he appeared, a figure in red, stepping through shadows that shouldn't exist in holy light. He killed every cultist in 7 minutes. Magdalena watched through cracked visor lenses as he moved like a nightmare's nightmare, tearing through corrupted flesh with hands that became claws that became shadows. When the last heretic fell, he looked at her, just looked, and in his eyes, those terrible crimson eyes, she saw something that shook her faith more than any demon ever could. Pity. He pitied her. Then he vanished, and she was left alone among the dead, wondering which was worse, being saved by an abomination, or knowing that the abomination had judged her faith and found it sad. She never reported it. How could she? She'd tell her canoness. An entity touched by chaos saved us, then left. She'd be executed for heresy, or worse, questioned by the Inquisition until they decided she was tainted. So she prayed instead, prayed for understanding, prayed for forgiveness, prayed for the Emperor to explain why his galaxy allowed things like the red shade to exist. The shrine didn't answer, it never did. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between evening prayers and morning duties, she wondered, what if the red shade wasn't chaos? What if he was something older? Something from before the galaxy learned to categorize everything into loyal or traitor, pure or corrupt, human or xenos? What if he was just lost? The thought was heresy, of course, dangerous heresy, the kind that got whole planets burned. So she locked it away in the same place she locked her doubts, her fears, her secret certainty that the Imperium was slowly dying, and she never spoke of it again. Across the galaxy, in a pleasure palace on a demon world claimed by Slanesh, cultists performed rituals designed to summon the Crimson Phantom. They offered blood, sensation, devotion, everything their Dark Prince demanded. The ritual worked, sort of. Something appeared in the summoning circle, not the red shade they expected, just a feeling. The sensation of being watched by someone who found their efforts pathetically amusing. One cultist, a former imperial noble who'd sold her soul for eternal beauty, felt that gaze settle on her and realized with horror she was boring. All her elaborate rituals, all her careful, cultivated depravities, all her pursuit of sensation beyond sensation, it was routine, predictable, mundane. The presence judged her excess and found it ordinary. The realization broke her more thoroughly than any torture. She fled the palace screaming, and 3 days later threw herself into a star. Her last words, recorded by a servo skull. He laughed at me, not with hatred, not with contempt. He just found me uninteresting. On Mars, deep in the restricted archives where only the highest Magos could access data deemed too dangerous for mortal minds, a forbidden text circulated among tech priests who'd grown curious about things they shouldn't question. It was titled The Outsider Hypothesis, and it proposed something radical. What if, occasionally, things from other realities leaked into theirs? Not chaos, not Xenos, just foreign, operating on different rules, incompatible with local physics. The text used the red shade as its primary example, suggesting he was evidence of parallel universes, alternate dimensions, pocket realities where the warp didn't dominate. The idea was fascinating, dangerous, heretical in 17 different ways. The tech priests who read it fell into two camps: those who deleted it immediately and purged their memory cores, and those who became obsessed, spending decades trying to prove or disprove the hypothesis. Several went mad. One claimed to have successfully opened a portal to another reality and was never seen again. His last transmission was just laughter, familiar laughter. The Inquisition tried to contain the legend, tried to classify it, file it, seal it away in vaults where myths went to be forgotten. But you can't kill a story by locking it in a box. Stories spread, mutate, evolve, survive. By the 4th century after Alucard's arrival, the red shade had become what the Imperium feared most, an uncontrollable variable. Not a clear threat that could be purged with bolter and fire, not a defined heresy that could be rooted out with faith and torture, just uncertainty, possibility. The idea that maybe, just maybe, the galaxy was more complicated than Imperium versus Chaos versus Xenos. That maybe there were things that didn't fit neatly into those categories. That maybe the universe was bigger and stranger and more terrible than even the Emperor had imagined. And in a galaxy built on certainty, on knowing exactly what you were fighting, exactly what you believed, exactly how you'd die, uncertainty was the most dangerous heresy of all. And somewhere in the deepest parts of the warp, in places where even the four gods rarely looked, that tiny fragment, that last spark of what had been Alucard, drifted through psychic currents and almost remembered, almost grasped what it used to be, almost understood why it had wanted death so badly. The memory was there, faint as starlight seen through fog, distant as a dream upon waking. I wanted to be human. I wanted to matter. I wanted my existence to mean something beyond hunger and violence. I wanted. The thought dissolved before completion, and the fragment drifted on, unable to die, unable to live, unable to do anything except exist as the galaxy's longest joke, an immortal who'd finally gotten his wish. He was no longer the monster, no longer the predator, no longer the thing that refused to die. He was just an echo now, a rumor, a ghost story told by people who didn't believe in ghosts. And maybe, in a way, that was the death he'd always wanted. Not destruction, just irrelevance. So what happens when an unkillable monster enters Warhammer 40,000? The answer, as it turns out, is both simple and terrible. The monster learns that in a universe built on suffering, immortality is nay. Not a power, it's a sentence. Alucard came from a world where he was apex, where death was a mercy denied to him, where he spent centuries searching for something, anything, that could give him the peace of oblivion. He thought he understood what it meant to be cursed. He thought he'd experienced every flavor of damnation his universe could offer. He was wrong, because his universe, dark as it was, still operated on rules that made sense: cause and effect, physics, biology, death as an ending, even if it wouldn't take him. But Warhammer 40,000 doesn't operate on sense. It operates on spite, on the fundamental principle that the universe owes you nothing, especially not the mercy of dying. The Imperium looked at him and saw heresy. The Chaos Gods looked at him and saw a meal. The Emperor looked at him and saw corruption that needed burning. None of them saw what he actually was, a refugee from a simpler darkness, stumbling into a nightmare so vast it made his centuries of suffering look like a warm-up. In his world, immortality meant watching everyone you loved die while you continued. In Warhammer 40,000, immortality meant being torn apart and scattered across dimensions, each piece convinced it was still you, each fragment serving masters you'd sworn to never kneel before. It meant having your identity dissolved not through death, but through infinite division, multiplication through subtraction, becoming everyone and no one simultaneously. It was a fate that even demons, beings literally made of warp stuff, would find horrifying, because demons at least knew what they were. Alucard no longer had that certainty. Think about what he lost, not his power, Power means nothing in a galaxy where planets burn as background noise. Not his immortality, that was the curse he'd always carried. What he lost was self, the ability to look in a mirror, metaphorical or otherwise, and recognize who looked back. The Imperium has a word for this kind of annihilation. Obliteration, not death, not even damnation. Obliteration, the complete erasure of personhood. And the cruelest part? He achieved it through resistance, through refusing to submit, through clinging to the one principle he'd always lived by. No masters, no chains, no surrender. His defiance, the thing that defined him more than his powers or his hunger, became the weapon that unmade him. He didn't fall because he was weak. He fell because he was exactly who he'd always been. And in Warhammer 40,000, being yourself is the fastest way to lose yourself forever. The galaxy doesn't care, of course. It never does. Billions die every day in wars that mean nothing, for causes nobody remembers, serving emperors and gods who view them as ammunition. One vampire's existential dissolution barely registers. The Imperium continues its slow decay. Chaos continues its eternal game. The Emperor continues burning on his throne, sustained by the sacrifice of psychers who scream all the way into oblivion. The machine grinds on, and somewhere in the gaps between, in the spaces where stories live after facts die, the legend of the Red Shade persists. 4 versions, contradicting each other, none of them true, all of them real. A myth that serves everyone's narrative. Khorne's followers claim he's proof that violence transcends universes. Slanesh's cultists say he demonstrates that even the purest predator eventually craves sensation. Nurgle's children see him as evidence that all things decay, even defiance. Tzeentch's pawns argue he's the ultimate symbol of change through destruction. And they're all right, and they're all wrong, because Alucard wasn't a symbol. He was just someone who made the mistake of wanting something impossible, to matter, in a universe where mattering is the most dangerous aspiration you can have. The Imperium teaches its citizens that their lives have meaning through service, through sacrifice, through dying for the Emperor and earning a footnote in some bureaucrat's ledger. The Chaos Gods offer meaning through transformation, through service to powers greater than yourself, through becoming part of something vast and eternal. Alucard rejected both philosophies. He wanted meaning that came from within, agency, choice, the ability to define his own existence, and the universe responded by showing him exactly what happens to things that insist on self-determination. They get broken down into components and redistributed, used, repurposed, turned into raw materials for someone else's story. The tiny fragment that remains, that last spark of awareness drifting through the warp, sometimes feels something that might be regret, not for the choices made, not for the gods defied, not for the violence or the hunger or the centuries of searching for death. Regret for something simpler, arriving in this galaxy at all. There was a moment, right at the beginning, when reality tore and pulled him through. A split second where he could have resisted, could have fought the warp's pull, could have chosen to remain in his own universe, bored and immortal, but at least himself. He didn't resist, because he was curious, because he wanted to see what existed beyond the boundaries of his world, because after centuries of invincibility, he'd become addicted to novelty, to new experiences, to anything that broke the monotony. And that curiosity, that simple human desire to explore, cost him everything. In trying to escape one curse, he found another. In searching for death, he found something worse. In pursuing meaning, he lost the ability to mean anything at all. But here's the truly horrifying part. Even now, scattered and dissolved and transformed into legend, he still can't die. The 4 fragments serve their gods. The tiny spark drifts through the warp. The legend spreads across the Imperium. All pieces of the same impossible whole, all continuing in their own way, all fundamentally unable to achieve the one thing he'd wanted since the moment he rose from death centuries ago: an ending. The universe granted his wish in the cruelest way possible. He's no longer himself, which is a kind of death, but his components persist, which means he never truly ended. Schrödinger's vampire, simultaneously dead and alive, existing in a state of perpetual maybe that would drive anyone mad if they were still coherent enough to go mad. It's the perfect punishment for something that refused to stay dead, not destroying it, just dispersing it so thoroughly that the question, is he dead or alive, becomes meaningless. He's both, he's neither, he's four different things and one forgotten fragment. He's a myth and a memory and a warning. He's everything and nothing, and he'll remain that way until the galaxy itself dies. So what did we learn from watching Alucard fall into Warhammer 40,000? That power means nothing when the universe operates on space. So, that immortality is not a gift, it's a variable that determines how long your suffering lasts. That identity is more fragile than flesh, and both can be taken from you in ways that make death seem merciful. That in a galaxy where even gods bleed, being unkillable just means you get to experience every possible way to lose. That curiosity is dangerous. That defiance has costs. That sometimes the worst thing that can happen is not dying. It's getting exactly what you wished for in the most careful what you wish for way imaginable. The grim darkness of the far future doesn't kill its monsters. It just teaches them that death was always the kindest option. And by the time they learn that lesson, it's far too late to die. There is no peace. There is no victory. There is no ending. There is only the eternal, grinding continuation of a universe that has weaponized existence itself. And somewhere in that darkness, a fragment that used to be someone named Alucard drifts through the warp and almost remembers what it meant to laugh. In the grim darkness of the far future, even death dies screaming. The red shade became four legends and one forgotten whisper, proof that immortality isn't strength, it's just how the universe measures how long it can torture you. Could Alucard have survived if he'd served instead of defied? Would submission have saved him or just changed the flavor of his damnation? Drop your thoughts below. And if you want more tales of what happens when power meets a universe built on breaking the powerful, hit that subscribe button. Because in Warhammer 40,000, there are always more monsters learning that they were never as unkillable as they thought. And their screams, those are just getting started.